thrilled today to have with us two star reporters from the New York Times, Cecilia Kong and Shira Frankel. And they will be talking about AI, reporting on disinformation, democracy, and governance. I should say that when we first invited them, I thought it would be good we do like sort of a 2-year anniversary of their book, An Ugly Truth about inside Facebook's world of domination. I'm sure I got the subtitle wrong there, but it's something like that. But you know, the fact that we've moved to this topic is a credit to what what's happening in the field, what's happening here at the Cyber Center, in that every 6 months we've got another new emergent either crisis or technology or topic, and I'm thrilled that Cecilia and Shira are willing to talk about this, because certainly it raises some of the issues that we've talked about in the previous sessions over the last month, where we've brought forth some of the Stanford professors' research on AI. Certainly, as many of you know, we are starting a program here in the Cyber Policy Center on governance and regulation of emerging technologies, with a particular focus on generative AI. And we have this huge effort here at the university on human-centered AI that we partner with quite often. And so, as with our previous seminars, Shira and Cecilia will talk for about a half an hour about this topic, and then I'll join them and ask questions from both the audience here and from the millions who are joining us online right now. You can just put the questions into the Q&A, and they will magically appear on my cell phone. So with that, thank you both so much for coming here, and Cecilia Kong and Shira Frankel.
Hello, and thank you so much, Nate, Professor Persily, for inviting us. I've had the great pleasure of getting to know Nate better and all of the great work that his center's doing, and it's in just the last 10 minutes we've heard that there's just so much more. And so in that way, I would say that Shira and I feel a little bit like imposters, because you've had some real subject experts come in and talk about the technology itself and policy, but we know a lot about reporting and journalism, so we can speak from that perspective. And personally, it's a great delight for me to be with my co-author, because I'm in DC, Shira's based here in California, and to be reunited because we continue to work a lot on the same topics. And that's kind of a good way of describing our talk today, but please, open remarks if you like.
Right, so as Nate said, we were approaching this talk and trying to think what would be useful for you as a group, and we realized that the same discussions we're having in the newsroom right now about what are the critical issues in technology, what are the critical things we need to explain to the public, were what we should really focus our talk on. And this convergence we've had of new technology, of iterative AI and disinformation, and what it's going to mean for society going forward, what it's going to mean here in the United States going into a critical election, what it's going to mean globally. It just felt like this was the right moment to have that discussion and really share our thoughts as reporters of how we're sort of thinking about all this. Yeah. And so here you have an example of 2 stories that we've recently worked on. Cecilia's worked on both of these. One is just a look at Sam Altman, his recent appearance before Congress. The other, we're sort of contrasting that with when Mark Zuckerberg was talking before Congress. Cecilia, I think you were there for both of these congressional hearings.
So what was really striking, and the reason why we thought this was a good way to start, is as journalists, this is big moments when Washington begins to pay attention. And there's talk about regulation in Washington. And we'll get to later about how nothing ever happens in Washington, but that's for later, the good stuff for later. But when Sam Altman came just a week ago and testified before a Senate panel, the tenor was very different from exactly 5 years ago, when Mark Zuckerberg came to testify for the first time before 3 different congressional panels, marathon hearings. But a lot of the themes are the same. A lot of the concerns are the same. A lot of the regulatory challenges are the same. The technologies are different, but one needs the other. You need to use platforms like Facebook and Instagram to spread information. The tools, though, are different that have been introduced. So we see that as an interesting sort of like two bookends to how we're thinking about coverage and AI. So again, this was just last week, Sam Altman, I know this is a sophisticated audience, so I'll say some basic things, but I'll assume that you know a lot. He's CEO of OpenAI that just introduced a generative AI tool known as ChatGPT. GPT-4 was introduced very recently. And since then, that was November of 2022, it has taken not just the world, but certainly Washington by storm.
One thing I want to just add about that is that one contrast between those two hearings was that when Mark Zuckerberg testified before Congress, the problems, or at least one set of problems, were already apparent. He was being called before hearings because Cambridge Analytica, Russian election interference, all these things had become apparent, and Congress wanted to talk about them after the fact, right? The problems had emerged, let's figure out what to do about it. One interesting moment that we find ourselves in right now is that this AI technology is really just beginning to emerge. We're in the infancy of seeing what it can do and how it's going to get used. And we're already having a discussion about what could the regulation be? What should we be looking forward to as problems? And as reporters, we've been commenting on if there is one hopeful note of, you know, journalism making a difference, it's that we are, maybe for the first time, talking about the problems that might lie ahead before they happen, rather than after they've happened.
So here are the two sort of like swirls of the dynamics that are taking place right now. So ChatGPT, as I said, was introduced, as we all know, November 22, to the public. Just like one anecdote of how Washington responded. Congressman Ted Lieu wrote in an op-ed in the New York Times as well as in The Hill, you know, I am freaked out. I ran a query through it and I wrote a whole speech came out and it sounded a lot like me and it completely, blew my mind and it made me realize I have to wake up to the power of this disruptive technology, and it's hard for me to even fathom what all of the potential dangers could be with this. Along with industry leaders in technology, we all know about 1,000 plus tech leaders signed a letter calling for a moratorium on the development of AI tools like ChatGPT. That was around the same time. At the same time, we have the business dynamics, and that is sparked, that the introduction of ChatGPT has also sparked a complete arms race when it comes to releasing competitive products. We know that Google releases Bard to the public in March 21st, 2023, around that same time, just a big AI frenzy. In our conversations with venture capitalists, that is where a lot of the money is going. Mobius AI, for example, gets 3 offers just in its first week of existence, valuing the company at $100 million. That was just last week. So that's just a couple examples of the forces at play. And we saw that in social media too. A lot of business interests that sort of rub up against and conflict with public interests. So is AI really a new thing? That's what we hope to talk a little bit about. We are not going to answer that question for you, but we think that we see, as far as journalism goes and how we approach our stories, is that we see a lot that is not that new when it comes to what's most important to us as journalists, which is to write about new technologies in the way where we hold powerful people, powerful companies to account, and where we also illuminate the public on what is actually happening, what the technology does and its power for good and for the potential risks. And we see a lot of reporting parallels with social media. So we're going to quickly flash back and let Shira go for this.
Well, one thing I was going to say about how nothing new is truly new is that at OpenAI, there are people working there who were actually at Facebook at its earliest days. And when we've spoken to them and they've looked at the threats ahead, they've looked at the problems ahead, they've commented on how it's following almost exactly the same pattern as what happened to them at Facebook, right? First came the porn, then came the scammers, and next they're looking at the bad actors. And they were like, it's almost like clockwork, and it's a heightened timeline from what they saw at Facebook. But in terms of what they've had to deal with, that is the exact order they had at Facebook, and now they're experiencing it at OpenAI. And one of them remarked that there's something almost comforting about the fact that threats have come in the same order, because they can see what lies ahead and they can try. It doesn't mean they're solving these problems before they happen, but it means that they at least know what's on the horizon. They know the scammers are there. There are people who are eager to make money off of this. They know after that the bad actors are one step behind. They're going to use this technology to try to affect elections, to try and fight sort of disinformation battles on behalf of private corporations and governments. And so it's been really interesting to speak to them and to have them acknowledge that like all technology, this will probably get used in ways that they find abhorrent, but that they are hoping to get ahead of it.
So just because memory is short and things change really fast, we're going to go through some of the greatest hits of the ugly truths of social media, okay? So you can see just a list of some of the things that we found in our investigation of Facebook that ended up being the biggest issues. Hate and misinformation, but let me just give some examples. Like, this was a pivotal moment. Sure, you can talk about this quickly.
Right. So honestly, to make it personal for a second, but this is when I sort of started paying attention to Facebook. I'd been a foreign reporter for a very long time, and then I moved back to America in 2015. Just before Trump made this comment about a total and complete ban on Muslims, he was running for office. I remember seeing that comment on Facebook and seeing the responses to that and the way in which that comment went hugely viral and thinking, this is fascinating. Like, what a fascinating use of this social media tool. He has figured out a way to get immense viral attention on social media by saying these really inflammatory things. Yeah. And there's something in and of itself fascinating. I haven't seen a political campaign like this before. And for a lot of us as reporters, that was a moment to really begin covering the Trump campaign, not just as a political campaign, but as a test for social media and for the role social media companies were going to take in democracy.
Yeah, and this is a real moment and an important moment in our book because it was the best sort of example of how the company struggled with its speech policies, and it continues to struggle today. These are some other examples, some of our colleagues, and Shira's reported from Myanmar as well, like struggling with the use of a platform in speech used to spread disinformation. I'm just going to go through this very quickly. You want to just give an example. Shira wrote a lot about coronavirus misinformation. I know you can't see her little head, but this is Shira right there. And she's been attacked for that as well.
Well, what's interesting about these examples from Myanmar this is an article I wrote about Mercola, who's one of the foremost spreaders of anti-vaccine ideology online, is that when they happened, they were the first, right? Like, Myanmar was a unique example in that it was a country that had been completely shut down, suddenly gets the internet, and really no one, other than a handful of people on the ground in Myanmar, had expected the rise in hate speech to happen the way it did. Mercola, also a first among his kind, figured out, wow, anti-vaccine ideology, I can use the same kind of viral lift and social engineering and turfing that has been used by terrorist organizations like ISIS to build a cult of personality for myself online, get people to buy my products, get people to join my groups. It was really fascinating, and I've always wanted to write this, but I'm sure I would get in a lot of trouble, comparing the tactics of some of these far-right extremism groups and Islamist groups like ISIS and the anti-vaccine movement, because actually in terms of the tactics they use to dominate the conversation and to get people into their channels, they're almost identical. So I've always wanted to write that as a story. But what's key here for us as reporters is that these were firsts. These were novel tactics, these were novel approaches, and the companies were struggling to figure out methods to deal with them as they were happening in real time.
And it was important with the Dr. Mercola story that the real thing that you're trying to show is the business opportunity behind it. That there's usually as journalists, a lot of what we do is to follow the money, and that shows us where the power lies and where the incentives are. So let's do a quick update. Where are we now? Like, you just did this great, Shira, data big dive on Twitter after Musk's takeover. Maybe you could tell real quickly.
Yeah, I mean, the social media and the internet has fundamentally changed in the last couple years, in that we've really seen a sort of a balkanization. People are not on a handful of social media platforms in the same way that they once were. And if people in government once hoped that by creating a uniform policy across Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook, they could control the flow of information online, that hope is now gone. Because the people that are churning out a lot of the conspiracy theories, a lot of the disinformation, the misinformation, are increasingly on fringe platforms. They're on Gab, they're on Truth, they're on Telegram, they're on small messaging groups, they have their own Discord servers. It is scattered across the internet, and they're scattered across a number of sites which no longer want to adhere to the same policies. Added to that, you have a new ownership of Twitter. I think everyone in this room knows Elon Musk has taken over Twitter, And he has been quite public about the fact that he does not want to lead Twitter in the same way it has been led. The story I think Cecilia was referencing, I did a look at hate speech on Twitter since Musk's takeover, and we, across a number of different researchers and organizations, saw huge spikes in anti-Semitic speech, speech against Black Americans, speech against indigenous groups, speech against various minorities here in the United States. And they were able to track that rise with Elon Musk taking control of Twitter. When we went to Twitter for comment, well, we got no comment actually, and then afterwards Musk just sort of decided to deny the story through a series of tweets. So it is a very different time, and the changes both in the landscape of all these companies and in the ownership means that, you know, these broader approaches that people once hoped to take are no longer applicable.
Yeah, and we've also found that the appetite for taking on disinformation has decreased quite a bit in Washington. I think it's just like the deadlock between Republicans and Democrats when it comes to disinformation and misinformation. It's become so politicized, the issues. Like Democrats want some sort of regulation that would clamp down on disinformation. Republicans think that it's censorship. It's just everybody wants to tackle speech, but in different ways. It's been just a lock. And also individuals are being targeted, researchers, et cetera. So it's been there's been a shift in Washington where you have like the House Judiciary panel, for example. They're really going after Democrats when it comes to speech. So there's a shift occurring right now. We'll see where that lands ahead of 2024, the presidential election. And on just really quickly, when it comes to regulations, nothing's happened. So nothing. That's my very fast update on that. Okay, so now we're thinking about AI. We are as obsessed at the Times and every other paper as you know everyone else is in Washington as well. It's become a big part of my beat and Shira's beat. I mean, you can look at sort of the list of the things that I just sort of like just put them down to the things that we think about: misinformation, labor and discrimination, election security, bias and surveillance, following the money. These are like the ways that we think about this. Regulations, media literacy, who are the tech titans, new characters. Like you can see that a lot of this sounds awfully similar to the way that we were covering social media. And I think that's an important takeaway, is that we try not to cover the technology just for the technology's sake. We want to understand what behaviors it creates and incentives involved in the businesses, as well as what the technology can enable, potentially harmful or not. But we do recognize that when it comes to AI, especially generative, that just like really capture the attention because it's moving so fast, there is the capability for some of these problems, these things that we think about like election security and misinformation, to be spread in much bigger volume, much more convincingly. Oops. So here are a couple, maybe Shira, you can go through a couple examples of AI.
I think the Pope coat moment was really the first real public moment in which the public saw the power of this new AI technology. A photo which was it was created in jest. It was created as a moment of levity by somebody using one of those programs that can automatically generate, you know, photos out of prompts or images out of prompts. It took the internet by storm. And initially, what was interesting, if you go back to those first few tweets, people knew it was an AI image. People knew it had been, but once it achieved a certain level of viral spread, people began sharing it, thinking it was potentially real, to the point where one of our colleagues at the New York Times, and I won't out him, but he thought it was real. He posted it in one of our Slack groups saying, can you believe this jacket? Right, so like these are tech reporters at the New York Times who were fooled by that image. And I think it was a moment where it just showed in a very like real and very obviously visual way how good this technology has gotten.
And that was a fun sort of example.
Right.
I can't see a lot of harm from that, but the middle image was just posted yesterday, not broadly, but this was an AI-generated image of some sort of explosion near the Pentagon. It was not real. This was synthetically created. But it actually affected the stock market. There was concern that there might have been some sort of national security breach, some sort of real explosion near the Pentagon. And for a while there it spread. It didn't spread a lot on some of the channels that we see, but the fact that the market responded and there was some chatter, it just shows you if it wasn't contained how quickly. It looks convincing-ish.
Well, this is also a really good moment to combine what we've been talking about with our current theme, which is that part of the reason it spread was because a number of blue check marks on Twitter, there's been business changes at Twitter which have allowed anybody to buy a blue check mark, and accounts with blue check marks who had changed their last name to Bloomberg spread the image. And so people seeing this, the public seeing this, saw an account which had Bloomberg in the name, which they associate with a reputable news organization, tweeting an image of an explosion in Washington, D.C. You can see how that creates an almost perfect storm of people believing something really bad had happened.
Yeah. This loss, I mean, I just can't resist. Who doesn't want to, Boris Johnson? So, like, dancing in a silly way. But I thought this was an interesting image to bring up only because, great, thank you. Because it shows actually how it's not, AI is not producing, like, such convincing, fakes in a way. Like, look at his hands. That's your first giveaway. Like, his hands are contorted. That can't be a real individual. Like, there's just like the size of his head to the size of the, his chest. Like, there are some like giveaways. Like, but that's kind of the world we're living in now, where every image, every audio file that comes, you almost have to doubt, like, okay, can this be real or not? Because it's become more convincing. But these are just some examples of the things that we sift through and think about. I also want to make the point that a lot of the scaries, the catastrophizing, is catastrophizing. It is hypothetical at this point, right? So the challenge as reporters is, and this happens with every new introduction of technology, it's like timing is really important. Like, when is it after the crater lands and you see the smoking, the remnants of the crater, like with social media, and then Mark Zuckerberg testifies? Or is it way before? Like, how early, is it too early to look around corners and it becomes too hypothetical to really warrant the concern? Those are the things that we try to balance as journalists. And we don't have perfect answers. And that's, I would tell you candidly, at the New York Times, we have these conversations about what are real threats and what are not. Is that going to be good? Oh, yeah. I'll just play this clip really fast. Thank you, Ben, with Ben's help. Oh. If you can...
This just in, we can now call the 2024 presidential race for Joe Biden. This morning, an emboldened China invades Taiwan. Financial markets are in free fall as 500 regional banks have shuttered their doors.
Border agents were overrun by a surge of 80,000 illegals yesterday evening.
Officials closed the city of San Francisco this morning, citing the escalating crime and fentanyl crisis. Who's in charge here? It feels like the train is coming off the tracks.
Thanks, Ben. So this was produced by the RNC, and it was released the day after Biden announced his intent to run again, and it was produced with AI tools, right? Is this disinformation, though? Is this, like, how concerned should one be? Like, this is all hypothesizing what the world would look like if Joe Biden were reelected. It doesn't feel good if you're Joe Biden to see something like that, nor would it be for many people. They don't feel a lot of comfort. But this is kind of the world that we're living in. This was the first release of a video that was official, using AI tools that gave us as reporters, but also like sort of like the political economy, if you will, pause to think about, okay, how are campaigns going to shape in the future, and the messaging and the information sort of pollution that's going to be out there. How do you debunk something like that? Because it is just a what if. They say what if over and over again.
Well, and I was just going to add that this is a pretty typical campaign video, right, in the themes. In that, in every election, someone's run a campaign ad against the candidate for president saying, well, if they become president, and then catastrophizing that presidency. That's not new as an attack tactic. What is new is how convincing was that recording of a news anchor saying that China had invaded Taiwan? How convincing were those images? Will your brain play tricks on you when you see those AI-generated images and the AI-generated voices, making it super realistic that all these horrible things are going to happen once Biden becomes president? Is that going to convince you to vote differently because the AI technology used is that much better? And that's a lot of what we're sort of getting at with this talk, is that the bad ways in which this is going to be used is probably not that different from technology already out there. It's just that much better. Is it that much more convincing? Is it that much more effective?
Right. So just really fast. since I'm based in Washington, I'm hoping that this might bring a perspective that's a little bit different to you folks at Stanford. The U.S. response to AI so far has been sort of an all-of-government response. The White House has come out with a Bill of Rights statement in the last year. Vice President Harris hosted the heads of OpenAI, Microsoft, Google, and I think another company, I forgot what it was, recently to talk about AI and company responsibility. The agencies have talked, and Congress is interested in legislation. It's all talk right now, right? It's very, very early. Nothing is started. So here's some examples. So Lina Khan, who is the chair of the FTC, she's been quite vocal, and my point is it's all of government, but everybody has different ideas, and right now it's very patchwork compared to how other nations are thinking about, especially the EU, about governance and AI. So Lina Khan, the chair of the FTC, wrote recently in an op-ed that she actually thinks that the laws in existence today, especially for the FTC, there's a Consumer Protection Act and there's also an antitrust act that the FTC enforces, those laws are strong enough for the FTC to go after AI companies that might, especially use AI for scams, to defraud consumers. She's thinking about how the future of competition in the corporate space would look if only big companies continue to gobble up the smallest companies. She's talked about that publicly. She very famously took on Facebook and its acquisition retrospectively of Instagram and WhatsApp, saying that looking around the question that the company basically used killer acquisitions to destroy future competition. It's a really novel approach to antitrust. I'll just go more quickly. The White House, again, that's a meeting with Kamala Harris, the vice president, the AI chiefs, and they talked about how they want the companies to take responsibility. A lot of folks, academic researchers, including at Stanford, point out that there should have been more people in civil society as well as academics who were included in these kinds of conversations, especially at that meeting. And I think that's a good point. The companies have a lot of say right now in Washington on this. So what's being discussed? Really quickly, in the US, there's talk about an independent agency. So think of the CFPB that was created not so long ago, but something that's just dedicated to AI where you have subject experts who could do things like hand out licenses, create safety standards, tests as well. There is talk about transparency on what data sets are being used to train these AI tools. There's talk about algorithmic transparency. There's talk about speech rules. Let me just tell you right now, that will go nowhere. Speech rules go nowhere, the idea of speech rules. The big questions, there was who will regulate and enforce in the US. There's the real there's a bias toward the idea that agencies should create their own rules and have powers over their own industries. Stanford Center for Human-Centered AI released a report where they said that as of now, though, only 5 of 41 major agencies have created AI plans as required. So they're really far behind. So you have this scattershot approach, but there's nobody kind of corralling all the cats, if you will. And of course, there's the approach of relying on current laws. And I'll just quickly say this too, so the US lags Europe, as we know. Europe is and China, I just in parentheses because those laws are loaded. And then for the European proposal, they're talking about risk-based regulations where certain AI tools should not be weighted the same as others. So say the recommendation engine of Yelp should not be regulated in the same way as, say, a driverless car. Those are the risks. So, and the US is a little bit more open to that as well, more these days, but far behind. Disclosure to individuals that they're what AI is being used to them, the idea of data transparency, and a complete ban on what Europe views as the most harmful uses of AI, such as social scoring, which is something that we know has been used in China and other nations. Please.
Well, I actually just wanted to prompt you to talk about something that you've talked about in our meetings.
Oh, yeah.
Which is that one of the unsaid things here is that while the U.S. wants regulation, it doesn't want regulation to the point where it actually slows down these U.S. AI companies, because they do think of this as a race against China, ultimately, both the U.S. and Europe are thinking about this very much. And please, I'm
Yeah.
really just taking your talking points.
Yeah,
Cecilia,
yeah.
We're
No.
talking about this a lot in our meetings. But, this is a very real, in a sense, arms race between what's happening in Europe and the U.S. and China. And so they're very conscious that if they do too much in this space, they could slow down and hinder U.S. companies.
Yeah, that's right. And let's be, I forgot to make this my, I'll go back to the very, very beginning. Actually, can we go back to the one with Sam and Mark? Not that I know them first name basis, but. Okay, so that kind of brings us back to the beginning. So Sam Altman testifies, and he says, we need to be regulated. That's why I'm here. I'm scared. I see great potential and more potential that's like very positive, but I am concerned. And there are some great risks, so we need help by government, right? So this feels new. In fact, Dick Durbin even says, like, this is remarkable. We've never had a tech executive come, we've had so many hearings, come and say, actually regulate us, right? My actual reaction was, oh, what is that regulation going to look like? Like this could be a really, really master stroke in regulatory diplomacy for him to come say regulate us, and then the regulations are actually like very weak sauce. It's like, let's just see what that looks like. So those are the things that I think about, and one of the biggest supporting factors for companies that might be wary, at least ostensibly wary, of regulations is that probably of greater priority, and right now this is actually just my opinion, this is not me saying this is like fact, but is I do think that the US v. China Cold War, I know that's overused, Cold War, in Washington, that issue, that dynamic, right now probably outweighs concerns about AI. And I think that with that in mind, that's always going to be a real buffer for companies who do not want regulations that slow down their growth. And the reason why I bring up Sam and say Sam Altman and my sort of footnote on how much regulation he wants is the fact of the matter is he is not tapping the brakes. 1,000+ tech leaders signed a letter saying we need a moratorium on the development of this because there's so much at risk. He's saying, I actually think that we will produce AI according to our country's democratic values, and we are the kind of people that you want to be in charge of making these kinds of tech. That sounds very similar to what we reported in our book with Facebook. There's a lot of this idea that somebody's going to do it. It should be us. So China's a big dynamic. The companies are a big dynamic. The company executives. Right now, people after that hearing, I got a lot of questions from other reporters and just generally on podcasts and stuff like this seems really different, right? And I said, no, I think TBD. Let's just see if it really is all that different because regulation is hard, and when it really comes to what the regulation looks like, I think you're going to see great disagreement. Even at that hearing, we saw IBM's Vice President of Trust and Safety say she does not agree with the idea of an independent agency. She said that existing laws are strong enough. We don't need a lot more regulation. That differed from Sam Altman, so you're already seeing the lines, the fissures between companies. So when it really comes to like the sausage making of law and legislation, I think you're going to see a very long, prolonged battle with a lot of disagreement. And even though Congress may be looking around the corner and acting more quickly, AI is moving much more quickly. Was sort of my takeaway. I don't know if you have any closing.
No, that was great. I'm looking forward to questions from you all, and Nate. Thank you.
So that was wonderful. Thanks so much. Those of you who are online can put your questions in the Q&A, and they will magically appear on my phone. In fact, we've already got quite a few that have come in. But since I've got the microphone, I want to start. And those of you in the audience here, please raise your hand if you have questions. I want to sort of, well, let me ask a churlish question to start. What's the New York Times policy on use of ChatGPT in your articles?
We just got a policy.
Yeah, what's the policy there? I'm just
This
wondering.
is brand new. Has this been reported public?
No, I don't.
It will be now.
It will be now. No, I think we can share this just between us friends. No, we've been told, as a matter of policy, not to put any of our unpublished stories or notes into ChatGPT, which makes a lot of sense, especially because we go through a fact-checking process. Sometimes in the earliest drafts, you haven't gone through that fact-checking process yet. You're just kind of like toying around with things you might include depending on how your sourcing works out. So yes, I mean, I think our editors very much expect that every word that goes into our articles is written by us. And I imagine that unless you're Kevin Roos and you've said this article is written by ChatGPT as the headline of your story, it would be, I imagine it would be a fireable offense if one of us was to be using ChatGPT to write anything.
And we have not gone like all in, like BuzzFeed and some other publications that are experimenting right now with it. And actually not even just experimenting, they're going all in. They're using ChatGPT for some of their stories.
Obviously, yeah, right. I mean, Bloomberg, we actually had, when Mark Lemley, my colleague in the law school, left one law firm to join another, Bloomberg reported it, but it was the Bloomberg bot that reported it. And it was actually an AI, that was
those are good use cases. I mean, look, as reporters, I think a lot of us would be very happy to never, ever write another earnings story again. Those are incredibly formulaic, right? It's the company announced this, this, and this. The stock went up by this amount. We usually pre-write 90% of those until the call actually happens. I don't think there are many reporters that would be like horrified if ChatGPT was writing those specific stories for us. But they're very narrow, and sorry, this is a bit philosophical, but the art of being a reporter is 90% in the reporting and 10% in the writing, at least how I see it. What makes for good reporting, the reason people subscribe to the New York Times is because we spend a lot of time talking to people. And at this point, that's not something ChatGPT can do, right? At this point, that's still what we think will distinguish good journalism.
So let me ask one question I think kind of undergirded a lot of what was in your presentation, which is whether this is the same battle as the social media battle. Because I think we're bringing to this, the rise of AI and rise of these companies, a mental picture that the problem is disinformation, antitrust, privacy, because that's those were the ugly truths that we've been dealing with for the last decade or so. In some ways, I think that it's different because social media and search are kind of easier things to define. As like when we talk about regulating AI, it's hard to even, as one of my colleagues has said, it's like saying regulation of the alphabet, right? Which is that it's not clear even what we're talking about when we're talking about regulation here. The kinds of the generative AI stuff that you're showing with the imagery, all right, that has a familiar feel to it, but it only makes a difference if it ends up going viral and having these impacts. But AI is going to increase the capacity of all good and bad actors, governmental and non-governmental, and so I wonder whether we are, in a sense, fighting the last war with this current war. Casey Newton, I was talking to you all before about this, I thought had a kind of provocative piece about a month ago about how do you cover AI? And I'm wondering how you're thinking about that. Like, how do you think about these companies? I mean, you've given obviously you've all written about it quite a bit, but dealing with the squaring the circle between existential risk and, oh, look at these interesting new tools. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? And then Maricha will be the first question. Yeah.
There are differeses, for sure. I mean, I think when you get into a lot of it, is hypothetical. And I want to mention our colleague Cade Metz. He is spectacular. He's a really great reporter. He's been a subject expert. He's been writing about this for a long time. He's had to navigate that timing issue on what is like real and what is not. He's very deeply sourced. So I think we are trying to approach this with humility, but with a lot of speed to try to catch up. Because there's education for us too, really, truly. I mean, generative is very different than, as we talked about some of the robotic stuff that we're talking about and machine learning, and as well as like then there's the other like whole category of like complete replacement of sentient, beings. Like that's, like how do we cover this in a way that's accessible to humans? I think for us, generative has been a real like a blessing in a way, and it's a vehicle that's very intuitive for people because they can use it and they can understand from a visual, audio, sense with how these tools are used. So I think we're learning, but
there are some wars that I mean, it's a good reminder, Nate. Like, I don't want to assume that, from my perspective, writing about regulation, that everything's the same. I mean, certainly labor is different. We think about, like, one big area that's missed is the way that that AI can get things so wrong, and how there can be, like, real discriminatory effects when it comes to housing, hiring, that kind of thing. So we think of things differently than social media.
Yeah, I think we've been talking a lot. I think generally we have a lot of reporters that are trying to straddle the line between, here are the warnings, here's the worst case scenario, here's the things it would be irresponsible for us to not report this, right? It would be irresponsible for us to not report on the first time that a generative AI bot gets used to spread a disinformation campaign, which we think is already happening, not here in the United States, in another country, but we're trying to report that out, right? That's an important moment in time that we feel we should report on. At the same time, we've got a columnist who's getting ready a series of columns of, like, how can ChatGPT make your life better? How can you use it in a practical day-to-day way? What is it good at? What is it not good at? The truth thing is something we're still thinking about. I've been thinking a lot about the data that initially got fed into those. I'm working on an entire line of stories right now, which is just looking at what was the data that first got fed into these systems. Like, the reason these systems are so good is because of the data that first went into them. And obviously each company's approach is differently, and a lot of these companies, including Google and Facebook, they're still deciding what they're going to use, what data sets they're going to use. And there's a real debate happening. I think Google has spoken about this a little bit publicly, so I'm not breaking too much news by saying this, but they are at this moment saying Gmail, right? Google Docs, do we use the text in those to train our AI? I mean, that could give them a real edge. I mean, that can you imagine if your emails could be used to train an AI model that would write emails in your own voice, and they could offer that as a service? I mean, that would be incredibly useful. It would also, for some people, feel incredibly privacy invasive. And Google is a company that's built its entire reputation on being private and secure. So those are real-time conversations we feel are important to talk. I was going to say about the factualness of some of these systems. I've been toying around with them, and just yesterday, I decided to try putting in a Google prompt of searching Google for what animals undergo a metamorphosis, because my daughter, my 3-year-old, had caterpillars at school, and I was saying caterpillars aren't the only animal that undergo a transformation. We were talking about the idea of changing shape. Google gave me a fairly good answer for other animals that go through a metamorphosis. And when I put the same question into ChatGPT, it gave me completely inaccurate information. It talked about a number of fish that live in sub-Saharan Africa that begin their lives as shellfish. I mean, it was like, it sounded completely believable, but was factually inaccurate. And that, for me, was, I mean, I think anybody that spent time on this has a real moment of, like, oh, this sounds so convincing, but is actually completely gibberish.
I'll say, in teaching my class yesterday on governance of emerging technologies, I actually had a student who did a presentation that cited an article I wrote that I never wrote. And so that was a first for me. Those of you online, don't do that. That's a failing grade. Maricha.
Thank you. My name is Maricha. I work on tech regulation here after having been a lawmaker in Europe making regulation. And so I think a lot about the power dynamics that are at play here and the enormous concentration of power in the hands of private companies. And when I looked at your list of topics that you're covering, I would also love to hear a little bit more about what it's like for you as journalists. I mean, how do you gain access to information? How do you gain understanding of how the AI works? I understand talking to people, but there's also the question of how can you independently verify some of the claims, or how can you understand the inner workings of these companies? And so could you speak a little bit to how you're navigating that, and whether you're concerned about your access to those kinds of details inside companies?
It honestly works a lot of the same way that traditional reporting works, in that we're not technologists. I mean, at the New York Times, other than perhaps our colleague Cade Metz, that's been covering AI for 15 years now. I mean, he's been following this more closely than I think any other reporter on the planet. He's perhaps a subject matter expert. The rest of us are just pretending. But we do it in the same way that we cover many other things, which is, as soon as a claim is made, we try to find ideally three or four independent sources that don't know one another at the company to verify it. Because the chances that 3 different people will tell us the same lie are pretty unlikely. And And so, I mean, I can just speak for instance about this data story. You know, I've spoken to people at Google who say they're already training on Gmail. I could, if I wanted to, write an extremely explosive headline tomorrow in the New York Times saying Google is using your Gmail data to train its AI. But I can't, because I need to find 4 more people who independently tell me the same thing. And so far I haven't. So far people have told me that they haven't used this technique, that they're still debating it. So as reporters, all we can do is report, right? That's why I said earlier that I'm not hugely worried about ChatGPT replacing us, because the art of reporting, the art of sitting in front of a person and trying to determine if they're telling you the truth and then having the wherewithal to say, that was really interesting, but I'm now going to go out and report this and make sure that the people telling me this information were physically in the room where it happened and saw this for themselves. That's what makes for good journalism, and that's how we verify. These companies are very secretive, and things like the data that goes into them, that's their secret sauce. That's what's going to make one, generative AI program better than another. And so they're very difficult to report on. But we approach it, in much the same way we do traditional reporting.
Yeah, and I think we can't underestimate the importance of
just
talking.
put your-
And I think we can't underestimate the importance of just talking to employees from the inside, protecting their identity oftentimes, because they're the ones that are closest to what's happening first and what's actually happening. It's just like Shira and I, like we used to joke, especially when we were writing the book, like our jobs are so not glamorous. A lot of it is just really hard work. Like we feel like we're digging ditches oftentimes. It's just like one person after another, talk to us, talk to us, talk to us, talk to us. And sometimes out of like 100 requests, like 2 people will say yes. But you just keep going and going. Then after 1,000, you get, like you see the math work out, and then you get enough people to have like the statistical confidence that you can go forward with the concept or idea. And it is just really continue to talk to people. But it is talking to people also asking them who might be critics or skeptics of what's happening. What should I be asking? What should I be looking for? And then going into those conversations with the people who are close to the source, really informed. But that all said, this is new. A lot of this is new. And a lot of this is a lot more sophisticated, the technology, than we've dealt with before, But that said, I mean, I thought search was real. I remember when Google came out, I was like, what? I don't get it. Indexing? But, now it's so intuitive, right? So it's like, this is one of the joys of our job. It's like learning new things all the time.
I'll say that if you want an AI trained on Google Docs or Gmail, you've got about a dozen people in this room who could do it for you right now, so you don't even need to go to Google for that. In fact, I'm having someone help me train an AI on my former clerkship recommendations that I've done for judges, so that then I can, not that I'm just going to turn it in that way if any of the judges are watching right now, but it certainly saves time. Why don't we go over there?
Hi, thank you so much. I was wondering, from all the coverage that you've done so far and the people you've talked to, what kind of solutions have you seen that you found or you think might be very productive in the future? For instance, there's been a lot of talk about watermarking, or like, as you were saying, disclosure, so people can know when they're interacting with AI-generated content. But then one of the discussions we've had in Professor Brasile's class as well is, in the future, if the social media or like online environment is dominated by AI-generated content, when will we need to have those disclosures?
Yeah, I mean, watermarking you mentioned is definitely something that I know all the companies are thinking about. OpenAI is interesting. They, obviously they limit the accounts, or they have knowledge of the accounts that they're allowing to use their service. They're not, as opposed to Facebook, which made their technology open for anyone to adapt and use for itself, which there's a whole debate raging on which approach is the right approach. OpenAI's approach is that we'll see what everyone's doing, and so if we violate our terms, we really quickly see it, and we can put an end to it. It was interesting because I was speaking to somebody from OpenAI who, again, previously worked at a social media company, and I was like, what, and he was like, ultimately, we are not going to come up with solutions here because people are always going to run bad queries, people are always going to use our tools for disinformation or whatever. But in his opinion, he felt that the only way to correct for all of this, for this technology that's emerging, is to have an internet, or specifically a social media network, in which accounts were verified, in which whether it's a real name, real identity, but some sort of system by which there was accountability in the accounts themselves sharing this information, that there wasn't the approach that we've had until now through Facebook and Twitter, which is that anyone can create an account and you can pretend to be someone else, and that anonymity allows for a lot of the problematic behavior online. So his opinion was that a social media company would emerge in which people felt safe knowing that the accounts on that social media service were who they said they were, and there was accountability for those accounts, because if I, Shira Frankel, shared a ChatGPT written message or a fake image, I would be held accountable as an individual. And I thought that was interesting. I think that he was kind of turning my question on its head of like, it's not us that needs to actually come up with a solution. What needs to happen is a different space online in which information is vetted and trusted because of the real identities behind the people involved.
Yeah, I'm hearing like really interesting debates about some solutions, the upsides and downsides. Like I'll give one example for licensing. Like that seemed like a real non-controversial idea that Sam Altman even talked about in the hearing. But then after hearing him talk about it, I've talked to some other really smart policy tech people, and they said, this will only entrench like the biggest companies because they're the ones who can afford all the legal and administrative costs, and they have the resources. And I didn't think it seemed like, it seems basic. Like you just license to the people who are able to do that. And then when it comes to also testing. So they're, creating the laws that don't squash competition, there's always a balance between the what you're trying to, your intent, and what the possible consequences can be. The other thing that I think, so there's that in terms of solutions, and there's technical solutions to the company. I do think that behavior-based solutions and laws or regulations might be an interesting area to explore. For example, discrimination. I mean, we already have anti-discrimination laws, but like really specific. Enforcement of those laws is really important. So having subject experts in Washington and in agencies and within the companies, perhaps, that are able to audit and make sure that these are priorities, and to enforce the laws that are already on the books, actually, but may need some updating. So I think that a lot of the solutions might come with regulation, as well as, but I think we're going to have really robust debate on the upsides and downsides of some of these proposals.
And we'll see. You look, as you sort of suggest, Europe might be the tail that wags the American dog here a little bit. And one thing I would add on the kind of antitrust trade-off thing, I was only half kidding when I was saying you can get 12 Stanford undergrads to do the Google thing, which is within a year we're going to have these models on our laptops, and so it's not going to be. That's one of the things that makes it a little bit different than the social media kind of network effects and the like. And so, as well as the concentration of PowerPoint, which is that some people always say, it would be great to have just 5 AI companies because then you can regulate them. But there's going to be all these little ones, as well as empowerment of the individuals. Yeah, was it Samid here? Yeah.
Hi, journalism ethics question. So, in your reporting of the nexus between misinformation and AI, how do you ensure that you don't create unnecessary fear amongst the public in a way that makes them think that the quality of the information ecosystem is actually much worse than it is, and it sort of accelerates a trend towards nihilism?
It's a good question. I'm part of a pod of New York Times reporters who works on misinformation and disinformation. I'm not a full-time misinformation reporter. We do have 3 full-time misinformation reporters. I would say that half their time is spent deciding not to write about something. Where we see something, a misinformation campaign, a conspiracy, something going on, and it just hasn't, the New York Times writing about it would amplify it, or would make it seem worse than it was. It would make the entire ecosystem seem worse than it was. That is, that is easily 50% of our Slack channel, is us gauging whether or not it's hit some very invisible marker that we honestly have internally at the New York Times of is this widespread enough that we need, that the confusion has been sowed, right? Where it's the Pope coat moment is a great moment for that, because it circulated, we laughed, then we saw people getting confused, then one of our own colleagues got confused, then we saw celebrity accounts sharing it. And it was really at that moment that we saw those bigger celebrity accounts with hundreds of thousands, where we were like, this needs an explainer. This needs a moment to say, yes, this image is excellent. It's very believable if you think the Pope would wear a puffy coat, right? Like, you might believe it. Let's write about it in a way which is revealing of how good this technology has gotten, so people understand, like, this technology really is excellent. It can but let's have the caveats. Let's have the caveats that, an expert on photography will be able to tell you that this is what's off on the image, and this is, let's have that moment of sobriety about how the limits of this technology, so that there isn't like panic. Everything you see online is going to be fake. But it really is like a day-by-day judgment call in which a group of people is constantly checking in with one another of like, are we walking this line the right way?
Right here, yeah. And then Sunny.
Okay, I hope this works. First, thank you for your terrific book. It was really fantastic. So about a week ago, of course, who knows in these days, but it was really a week ago, Eric Schmidt was on Meet the Press talking to Jacob Ward, and he said something to the effect, and I'm paraphrasing, that like, basically nobody else can regulate AI but us. And I think the underlying piece to that was policymakers are just too stupid. Like, they just don't get it.
Us meaning his foundation?
Us meeting
tech bros.
Tech bro.
tech, industry tech. No, so just ignoring the absolute self-servingness of that comment. You talk to a lot of people, including a lot of people in Congress, a lot of staff, and so I'm just curious, like, what is your reaction when you hear? I mean, he's obviously playing into this concern that our policymakers don't get the technology, but I'm curious kind of what you found on the ground.
So that's so interesting. I missed that. He has spent time in government. He was the chair of one of the, what was it, the AI, it was in the Department of Defense, right? I'm sorry, my mind is blanking. So anyway, he has served a tour of a leadership position, right? So he has seen it firsthand. Let's also remember that he famously said in 2010, if you're concerned about privacy, maybe you shouldn't be doing things that that you don't want to be known online. so let's let's remember that. There is a real problem with the skills/knowledge gap when it comes to technology in Washington, and that is for real. I see it for sure. The questions weren't as embarrassing in this last hearing with Sam Altman than it was, in many other hearings with tech CEOs. There is just, I think Congress is really afraid of continuing to look stupid. And in fact, I was just talking to a staffer on a different Senate panel, not the one with that hearing, saying that they've held a couple closed door meetings, like hearings actually, with AI executives that they don't want public because they didn't want their questions to get out. And I said, I don't think I've heard of a closed door hearing. So I'm looking into that, FYI. So that was interesting. So it's a real concern. And there's not a lot of incentive for those who do have who do have the technological expertise to join government. That said, some of the initiatives that have been kind of interesting. Oh yeah, thanks. Some of the initiatives that have been kind of interesting from the government lately in the CHIPS Act, as well as in this latest AI Statement of Principles, is more funding for NIST and some other government agencies that can draw in more scientific talent and to try to boost and bolster research that's government led. I think DARPA is even continuing to take a deep role. Remember, AI is not new in government. It's DARPA's been around for a long time. So it's just the incentives are sort of off. So needs to be. I've long felt like there needs to be some sort of better marketing in Washington to try to bring people with different, with a different sort of mission in mind. So that's true. There is a knowledge gap. But I feel like the idea of technologists self-governing has never, in the last decade, 2 decades, turned out to benefit consumers as much as they need. So for him to say that is kind of on brand, so I'm not super surprised. But I'm dubious when I hear that.
We've actually run out of time. I don't know if Sheriff, if you have any last thing you want to add to that. Or if we beat up on Eric Schmidt enough at this point.
I think Eric Schmidt is taking this. We'll hang out for a little bit longer if people have
Wonderful.
questions they didn't get to ask. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody in the room and online. Next week, we've got Dee Yang from our computer science department who's going to be talking about challenges and progress towards socially responsible NLP. For those of you who don't know what NLP is, the answer may surprise you. So come back. Thank you again. Bye-bye. Yeah, because they're always...